A silence thicker than regret settled when you realized they'd rewritten your worth without a second thought. You felt it in the empty space beside your name, in the subtle shift of their eyes when they no longer needed your approval. That moment when the blade of indifference slid clean through your trust, exposed the raw edges you'd been hiding. You sat there, heart pounding, as the world around you carried on in unremarkable indifference, and something inside you cracked open. In that fracture, you heard a truth you'd never dared to speak. They didn't fear your pain. They feared your reaction. They didn't step back because they felt guilt. They stepped back because they lost control. The realization burned colder than any apology. It whispered that power never lives in forgiveness, but in absence, your refusal to engage in their games. You've chased kindness like a lifeline, pouring into empty vessels that spilled contempt in your face. You've crafted explanations, apologies, justifications, each one another invitation to be disrespected. But in this wake of betrayal, a transformation waits, not through skills or feel-good affirmations, but through a confrontation with your own habits of self-betrayal. You must become the stillness that unsettles the storm, the pause that fractures their strategy. Let this moment mark the end of your pleading and the start of your presence. No more reaching for validation in their hollow smiles. No more fracturing yourself to fit their narrative. In the cold light of this betrayal lies the seed of a strategy older than comfort, sharper than hope. It's Machiavelli's method, unyielding, unromantic, unbreakable. If the echo of that fracture still rings in your veins, if you're ready to redefine power in your silence, subscribe and join those who've chosen absence over appeasement. Speak in the language they cannot interpret. You're calm. You felt the shift the moment you stopped defending your edges. It wasn't a grand gesture or a public speech. It was a quiet pause after their accusation. A weightless absence in the room where they expected your protest. Your silence became a riddle they couldn't solve. In that vacuum, they began to fill the space with doubt about their own certainty. They'd practiced their lines, sharpening guilt like a blade. You watched them deliver each syllable as if you'd practiced on you. But this time, you offered nothing. No flinch, no flash of hurt, just the steady pulse of indifference. You'd learned that reaction is currency, and you were bankrupt. They leaned forward, searching for cracks, for hesitation to exploit. They leaned back, searching for empathy to weaponize. You remained still, unavailable, unreadable, unassailable. With each attempt, their words lost impact. They were voices echoing in an empty chamber. When they called you cold, it was a confession. They couldn't navigate the terrain of your mind because it had shifted beneath their feet. You weren't a mapped route of predictable emotions anymore. You were a fortress whose drawbridge was raised. Remember the nights you replayed every argument, rewinding remorse like a broken record? Now, you let those echoes dissolve. You stopped reliving old wounds and watching them bleed. You let the wounds dry in the dark, turn into scars that nothing could penetrate. They tested your boundaries with the same questions you once begged them to answer. Why did you leave me hanging? Don't you care? Explain yourself. Each inquiry was a lit fuse, and each one fizzled against your quiet resolve. You didn't become unshakable by willpower. You became unshakable by absence, by removing the fuel that fed their fire, by refusing to hand them the levers of your mind. They traded their power for your reaction. You traded reaction for emptiness. In the mirror, you saw the lines around your eyes deepen not with sorrow, but with clarity. You saw a version of yourself untouchable by their tactics. No more chasing understanding from the ununderstanding. No more bargaining with respect. You became the demand, not the supplicant. They tried to draw you out with sarcasm, guilt, confusion. You answered with the weight of emptiness, a presence heavier than any outburst. They recoiled from you as if you were a wound reopening, as if your stillness was a threat to their identity. This is not confidence painted on. It's a surgical removal of permission they once held. You excised the parts of you that begged for approval, that knelt at the altar of their whims. What remains is a silent altar to your own sovereignty. When you stopped needing them to acknowledge your value, they discovered your value. Not in praise, but in the absence of your need. They began to respect the space you created, a territory they could no longer invade with guilt or pity. Feel the weight of that power settling in your bones. You are the ceasefire in a war they started. You are the mountain they can't climb because your summit rests beyond their reach. They edged closer, testing the reach of your reaction, as if proximity alone could reignite the spark of your surrender. But you withdrew farther into stillness, each step away adding weight to your absence. They grasped at echoes of your voice, as if you'd left instructions, not questions. Their contempt was loud, a clamor of bitterness seeking your rupture. You did not comply. You offered them only space, an unlit void, where even their anger could not burn. In that void, they hunted for emotion, tripping over echoes of their own expectations. You remembered the nights you shaped your words to their mold, flattening your edges until you fit the role they cast. Now, you refused the mold. You reshaped the room with your silence, bending their focus inward until they met themselves alone. They spoke in riddles of blame. You're the only one who doesn't see. They cast shadows of doubt you once carried like stones in your pockets. You let those shadows recede into the corners where they belonged, unseen, unmourned, unnecessary. Every attempt to provoke a reaction was met with the same void. No protest, no panic instead. A measured inhale that slowed the world around you. They watched your chest rise and fall, and realized your rhythm no longer danced to their tune. You were no longer a surface to polish. You became an abyss to avoid. Their words clattered against your stillness like stones against granite, no dent, no mark, no echo. They tried confusion next, layering contradiction upon contradiction, hoping you'd chase clarity in their chaos. Instead, you folded yourself into the emptiness, letting confusion swirl around you without an anchor. You felt their frustration bloom, purple and raw. They'd expected your surrender, your scramble. They'd banked on your habit of bridging every gap with apology or explanation. But this time, the gap became a canyon. In that canyon, you found your footing. Each step on its edge reaffirmed a truth too sharp for softness. Absence is the weapon they cannot disarm. They cannot argue with what they cannot locate. They whispered that you were unreachable. Unreachable, as if it were an insult. But you recognized it as the highest compliment, proof that your boundaries had become your shield. They unleashed a final gambit, empathy disguised as scorn. I'm only saying this because I care. Their words tried to seep in as poison, coated in the sugar of concern. You tasted the deception and spat it out with your silence. At the core of their plea was one desperate confession. Without your reaction, they lost control. That is the moment you cease to be negotiable. That is the moment you stand beyond the sway of their tides. Your stillness was not emptiness, but presence magnified. You were an unlit beacon, drawing none but exposing all. They could see their reflection in your eyes, their own need, their own hunger. They tried one last phrase. You're too proud. They meant it as condemnation. You saw it as recognition. Pride is the last bastion before submission. You had reclaimed it. Their shoulders slumped. They retreated. No dramatic exit, just the slow folding of expectation when the script no longer fit. They left you with the residue of their absence, a hollow they once expected you to fill. You did not fill it. You let it remain an echo chamber for their own doubts. You let it breathe, expand, collapse on itself. Feel the pulse of their retreat. It beats in your veins like confirmation. Your silence became a verdict, and they left without appeal. You did not win by breaking them. You won by breaking the pattern they controlled. You won by becoming the question they could not answer. They returned once more, quieter this time, as if approaching a predator they couldn't yet see. You felt the tension in the air, a tightening knot of expectation, and you leaned into it, leaning away. You never raised your voice. You never flinched. You simply remained a still point, an island they couldn't invade. Their words came soft temptations, confessions, half pleas wrapped in accusation. They tried the old gambit: stir regret, provoke sympathy. I was wrong, but you. Their pause was an invitation. You did not step forward. You folded your arms inward, not to defend, but to contain yourself. They spent years mapping your gestures. Now those maps were useless. When they offered a glimpse of vulnerability, I feel lost without you. You met it with equanimity, not pity. Pity was a dagger that wounded the giver as much as the receiver. Instead, you tilted your head, as if studying a puzzle whose solution lay in their reflection, not your response. In that tilt lived your power, the hint of curiosity, the absence of attachment. They lunged with memories, shared moments you once clung to, relics of trust now turned to ash. Each memory was a trigger they hoped would detonate your composure. You watched the embers and exhaled, letting them drift apart. Your mind catalogued nothing. Your heart archived nothing. All that remained was the quiet fact of your own sovereignty. They launched into recrimination, listing every fault they believed you committed. The times you stayed silent, the times you spoke too softly, the times you weren't enough. They fanned those embers into a flame they thought would draw you back. You did not shield yourself. You simply stepped aside. Their fire illuminated the empty space where you once stood anxious. In that space, they saw only their own reflection. Then they tried betrayal's reverse. Flattery. You're always so composed. I could learn from you. It should have been a compliment, but you recognized the hook. They wanted to enter your fortress disguised as a student. You allowed the words to pass, like rain over a stone roof, heard but not absorbed. Their flattery fractured against your resolve, revealing a desperate need to belong again. You remembered the person you used to be an actor on their stage, performing emotions borrowed from their script. Now you were the audience, watching them perform to an empty seat. Their longing became theatrical, and you watched them stumble through lines that once held you captive. They fell silent, as if exhausted by their own theatrics. You watched their chest rise and fall, heard their breath catch. You let the silence stretch until it felt like a verdict. You had removed the props. No anger, no justification, no defense. Only the raw courtroom of presence. When they finally spoke again, their voice hollow, you realized they offered no new weapons. They circled the arena, lost without your reaction to guide them. They had become orphans of your attention. You felt no triumph, only the fulfillment of an absence, a vacuum that neither apology nor accusation could fill. Feel the gravity of that moment. You stand unmoved, not because you conquered them, but because you surrendered the right for them to move you. In your silence lives an unspoken command. Define me on your own terms, or not at all. Their choice is not yours to steer. They hovered on the edge of your presence one last time, as if the air between you held some secret gravity they needed to decipher. They whispered questions you once rushed to answer. What do you want from me? Their voice trembled with the hope of your direction, the way a moth flutters toward imagined warmth. You offered nothing but the thickness of your silence, and in that void they found the first taste of fear. Their tactics grew desperate shadows, slipping into daylight. accusations clothed in concern, confessions wrapped in blame. Each gesture was designed to break your stillness, to draw you back into the cycle of reaction. But you had already stepped outside their orbit. You observed their movements like a chess master, unhurried, untouchable, letting their pieces crowd the board without a single counter. They pleaded in half-truths. "I've changed." It was a confession of their own failure, a concession that if they truly had changed, your reaction would have been different. You held the mirror steady, showing them their reflection. Unflinching, unmasked. You watched as they stumbled over their own words, realizing they'd rehearsed apologies they never believed. They tried one final maneuver, inducing your nostalgia. They conjured memories of laughter that once echoed between you, of moments when you believed them invincible. Their voices softened with longing, coaxing you toward a trap you had dismantled long ago. You felt the tug of memory, but you did not follow it. You stayed at the edge of that echo, letting the past shimmer like distant stars, beautiful, unreachable. They reached for closure, as if closure were a transaction you owed them. They offered their version of peace, if you would only speak your piece. You weighed their offer and found it empty. You recognized that closure is a gift you give yourself, not a debt you pay to someone else. So you let their words fade into silence, a requiem for expectations you no longer hold. In their exhaustion, their final words emerged as a confession. "I miss you," not as an apology, but as a longing. And, in that admission, lay their defeat. They missed not you, but the reaction you sparked. They wanted their former power back. They wanted the chess match they once controlled. You met their confession with a quiet nod, acknowledging the truth without embracing the sentiment. They turned away slowly, as if retreat were its own act of defiance. You felt their shoulders slump, an unconscious release of the tension they'd carried for themselves. In that retreat, you sensed the shift. They were no longer adversaries, but distant figures wandering from the battlefield you deserted. You did not call them back. You did not wave goodbye. You merely stood, watching the space they left behind. In the emptiness, you heard your own heartbeat steady, measured, sovereign. You realized you had traded the exhaustion of defense for the power of presence. You had transformed your absence into an unspoken edict. Define me on your own terms, or let me be. The ground beneath you was your own making, solid and unmoving. This is the culmination of their final gambit. The moment they realized your value was never in your words, but in your refusal to speak. They discovered the truth no apology could convey. Silence is not surrender, but command. And in that command lives a force beyond apology, beyond explanation, beyond their reach. They came back with broken resolve, as if the entire campaign of their emotions had been reduced to a single fragile beam of hope. And that hope was you. They whispered your name like a talisman, believing that in summoning it, they could reforge the bond they'd shattered. But you heard only the hollow echo of a shell with nothing inside. In that echo, you recognized the final revelation. They sought not your company, but your permission. Every plea, every accusation, every feigned confession was a plea for permission to remain in your orbit. You understood then that you had been handing them the keys to your psyche every time you reacted. You had been the architect of your own captivity. They tried one more tactic: reversal. "You're the problem," they spat, bearing their contempt as a weapon of projection. They painted you as the villain in a play they wrote when it suited them. Yet in their cowardly projection lay the purest testament to your transformation. You were no longer a passive target, but a force they feared. Your absence became their accusation. You felt the moment they realized they could no longer project onto you, because there was nothing left to project. No more guilt to harness, no more tenderness to exploit. You had stripped away the emotional fixtures they depended on, leaving only your skeletal frame of unyielding presence. They searched that frame for flaws, but found only your unspoken decree. I own my peace. They attempted surrender cloaked in flattery. You're impossible to reach. It was a confession of their own impotence. You let the statement hang like a verdict, your silence knitting itself into a crown. In claiming you as unreachable, they had crowned you sovereign of your domain, untouchable, unassailable. You offered no correction. The truth of their words was your final blow. You watched them shrink beneath the weight of their own tactics, their strategies, despair, guilt, anger, nostalgia collapsed into a single, empty gesture. They stood before you, naked in their own defeat, and you realized your power had never been in what you said, but in what you withheld. Their defeat was self-inflicted, born of their insistence that you supply meaning. In the aftermath, you felt the cool wash of clarity flood through your limbs. Your heart, once a battleground of doubt and yearning, pulsed with a new rhythm, one of sovereign detachment. You carried no resentment, no triumph, no sorrow. You carried a quiet affirmation. You are the only arbiter of your value. Their departure was not celebration. It was confirmation. Let the residue of their final retreat settle in your bones. This is the apex of Machiavelli's lesson. Power is forged in the crucible of absence, tempered in silence, and wielded without apology. They learned that you cannot be cajoled or coercively guided. You become what you permit yourself to be, and you have permitted only your own unbreakable presence. They never returned to negotiate, because there was nothing left to negotiate. In the echo of their absence, you discovered the hardest truth. Power is not seized in the clamor of confrontation, but in the silent refusal to engage. You did not dismantle them. You dismantled your own need for their verdict. In that revelation lies the final shift. Your worth is not a negotiation, a debate, or a performance. It is a constant state of presence, unburdened by reaction. No apology can erode it. No plea can resurrect it. You stand apart, not out of loneliness, but by design. Feel the distance you've created, cold, unassailable, precise. It is not a wall, but a boundary you defined, not to keep others out, but to keep your power in. In this boundary lives your sovereignty, an uncompromising truth that neither trembles under temptation nor shatters under assault. Let them learn, in their retreat, that absence is the final verdict. Let them carry the weight of unspoken questions you refuse to answer, and let your silence be the reminder that the only approval you need is your own. If this resonance cuts through the silence you've carried for too long, leave a comment below and join the ranks of the unbreakable.